Hi, everyone. Welcome to my session. I'm Lena Darnay from Keep Indiana Learning. I'm so excited to share with you a little bit about how we can be on the lookout for high quality technology integration in our classrooms as we are evolving out of pandemic implementation of forced digital remote hybrid learning and really into that purposeful use of technology, these new skills that we have gathered as educators throughout the last few years of panic implementation, right? Like we've had to be in a bit of a petri dish, so to speak, during this pandemic where we're really trying new things and seeing what grows and we don't have a lot of time to reflect. And so this session is going to be focused on how we can think thoughtfully about what we take with us when we transition out of pandemic implementation and into whatever the new version of education, that landscape looks like moving forward. As I said, I'm Lena Darnay. I'm a learning architect with CIESC, the Central Indiana Educational Service Center, specifically in Keep Indiana Learning, our professional learning department of CIESC. And as a learning architect, I work with educators, schools, districts across the state on those structures and environments for learning and building those collaborative spaces, technology enhanced spaces, thoughtful areas where we can be student centered, really putting all those scaffolds together and supporting the structure of learning. You can find me at keepindianalearning.org. I'm also on Twitter at Lena Darnay. Our learning intentions for this session. I think this is a very important thing to start with. We are learning to explore the Indiana Department of Education Educator Standards for blended and online teaching. We will learn to prioritize elements of the ESBOT for our district or school, depending on our frameworks, goals, those initiatives you already have going. This should feel like it weaves in, not layers on top. And then we'll use those prioritized ESBOT priority learnings that we'll look at to guide your teacher growth in instructional technology usage. If you're a follower of John Hattie's work in Visible Learning, this effect size for learning intentions is a 0.54, which means it's above the hinge point and really makes a difference in our growth. The success criteria for today's session, or what it looks like when you're done, is that you will be able to locate and access those IDOE educator standards for blended and online teaching. You'll be able to identify elements of those ESBOT that will support your school or district's frameworks, growth, goals, and initiatives, and that you could use your identified priority elements to guide growth for your teachers. The effect size of success criteria is 0.88, which puts it almost a year over what you would standardly see in growth of a year, academically speaking. So success criteria is a really high impact strategy. Okay, let's talk about these educator standards for blended and online teaching. If I was there with you in person, I would guess if by a show of hands, how many people know that these exist would be lower than 100%. I would say lower than 50%. I might even guess that I would see only a couple of hands go up. And that's because these are pretty new. They came out in March. They were ratified and approved in March of 2021. So they're just kind of a fledgling brand new set of educator standards, but they were really developed thoughtfully through some traditional digital learning standards that existed in the IDOE space and taken a very close look at during the pandemic, which makes them very applicable to our current environment and really relevant to the conversations that will be happening as we transition out of the pandemic and into our new normal. Let's look at some of the important context of how they were developed. So like I said before, there were some digital teaching standards that existed from the DOE, but a group of educators from around the state, including Kara Heichelbeck here on CIESC's staff in the IO department, the Indiana Online, she's the assistant director there. She was part of that group that got together and said, we need to really update these because the world has shifted. They looked at 2 other sets of standards that are national or international to be able to inform our understanding of what these would look like in Indiana. Those 2 standards are the ISTE, Standards for Educators. ISTE stands for the International Society of Technology and Education, and NSQ, those national standards for quality online teaching. That's important because they do have a crosswalk in that standards document that allows you, if you're an ISTE school or if you use NSQ and their Quality Matters program, you'll be able to see how these Indiana standards overlap and encompass the thoughts, processes, ideas, and strategies within those other sets of standards. So let's talk about some of the vocabulary, because we can talk a lot about the same thing in different ways in education. There aren't a lot of new ideas, but we have new terminology often that can get kind of muddy. So when we talk about digital learning within the context of the Indiana Educator Standards, or just in general in this session, I'm talking about any instructional practice that effectively uses technology to lift the learning. So not just I put a PowerPoint on the screen and therefore I am integrating technology, but I am lifting the experience and encompassing a wide spectrum of tools to drive deeper, more connected learning with my students. Blended means that digital learning experiences are incorporated into the traditional classroom setting. So the fact that people might say, well, I don't need to learn about digital learning because we're in person, means that we are really denying the ability to leverage technology in a way that feels like we are encompassing that wide network out in the world beyond our classroom doors and walls, and connecting our students to the creativity, the communication, the critical thinking, the collaboration that can happen when we bring technology into that traditional classroom setting. So when we talk about blended, that means we are in person, but still using technology. We are leveraging a learning management system and some collaboration software like Google or Microsoft 365, right? So that we're blending those experiences together. Of course, remote learning is still a thing, not only as a pandemic implementation where digital learning experiences allow a student to be separated from the teacher by space or time, but we also have a new rise in all virtual programs or complete schools. Like our Indiana online program here at CIESC, they've been around for years and have been doing online learning for many, many years. But now we also have the Indiana Online Academy, which is a full and complete virtual school. And that's a way that we will enhance the learning experiences for those students who find that virtual really works well for them. When we talk about that all 100% virtual experience, we'll call that remote learning. And then hybrid is really a combination of both. That's where a lot of our schools are living when we have students that go on quarantine and they need to go remote, but we still have some students in person that might be using technology in a blended way. So when we loop all those together and we have those different versions fitting in the same space, we'll call that hybrid. Now, how should we use these standards? These standards are not supposed to just be like applied to every teacher and they have to hit every level of them, or it should not be layered as one more thing. Really, they should be used to guide pre-service programs so that the new teaching with technology coursework that our pre-service teachers would engage with isn't just how to make a PowerPoint or how to put your lesson plans in a Google Drive folder. It really talks more about that experience of lifting the learning and guiding our universities that are preparing our teachers to potentially get into the mindset of what the new version of teaching and learning, that landscape we're moving forward to, really encompasses. Now, this also should be used as a guide for our existing teachers and that professional development. Personally, that's how I use it the most. As a professional development specialist, I create content that enhances learning for educators and demonstrates a blended approach to using some technology tools along with some face-to-face and in-person interactivities and really bringing them together. So I use it as professional development. You might also use it as professional development. And if you're coming from the higher ed sphere, you might see it as used to inform your pre-service practice. Now, in K-12, you as administrators probably need to look through this and see where your need to knows might fall. Those conscious understandings of we need to grow in this area. Because these standards are new and because a truly thoughtful approach to technology integration might be new to you as well, you could use these standards to develop a list of those knowledge and skills that you could work over time to blend into PD or to PLCs, or how you're helping your teachers grow. And then the educators themselves could look at these and reflect on their own practice and work with them to set those professional development goals for themselves or really stretch their own learning. One thing we've noticed in the pandemic is that teacher cognitive growth, when it comes to professional development, has reduced in size from big understandings of lofty goals and stretching ourselves to grow in major ways to I need this knowledge right now, and I need to fix these problems right now, and I need support with just in time, in the moment, in my hand type learning. A lot of these standards address bigger growth areas, and so could feel a little overwhelming if they were to be broached right now in the teacher sphere. So what I would suggest is, as a leader in your building or in your district, that we look at these standards as a way to say, what are our teachers really learning right now in this moment of forced implementation of technology application in the classroom? And how do we use those in the moment skills that they have learned to show them that they have still been making professional growth, that they are still really adding to their repertoire of teaching skills, and that this is a way to indicate, like, look, those are legitimate learning jumps that you made, that your kids made, that we as a collective group made, even though you felt like you had to turtle in and really focus in on being almost a brand new teacher again with all the technology. The fact that you had that unexpected learning in those moments should be embraced and championed. And these standards could really do that for them. So let's look at the standards. So I want to go through these, and they are a little dense, but that's the nature of standards. And so I've highlighted or bolded some of the key words that I feel like you could take from each of these standards. There's 8. We're going to go through them just briefly. I've given you a link to this slide deck, so you can absolutely have those, and it has a link to the standards themselves. So I totally want you to explore them as you find need for that. The first standard is on learning environments. And really that's like, I have a physical classroom and I set my physical classroom up to be interactive, collaborative, productive, inclusive, and safe. So how would I translate that into my blended or online space? So when I'm teaching remote and I'm in Zoom and I have those learning management systems like Canvas or Google Classroom or Schoology going, and I have my productivity software like Google Docs or Microsoft 365, and I have some technology tools like Kahoot or Quizlet or Wakelet, what am I doing to make sure that those digital environments are not just gadgety for gadget's sake, but really are purposefully used for collaboration, used for interactivity and engagement, and accessible to all my learners? So making sure that they're not too busy, that they have closed captions, if that's a way that we can do that through Zoom or Google Meet, and that they're safe. So we're not asking kids to put their private data out there just to be able to use a tech tool. So it's really about making the mental shift that my digital space needs to be as safe and welcoming and accessible as my physical space is when they're in my classroom. Some of those indicators, these are always, of course, you've got the big standard and then you've got the indicators. So these are in there, but I just wanted to highlight a couple for you. What I love about standard 1 is it is really about building relationships and still having that space to connect to each other as learners and instructors, and making sure that that still makes sense even when we go online. So if I have classroom norms and procedures, that we hear all voices, that we take turns, that we have growth mindset for ourselves, that, those things that we would have in class that really talk about setting ourselves up as learners, do we still have those in our digital space? Are we consistent so that if we do have to go back and forth for a quarantine or, a remote shift, that it's not a huge break in transition between the two, that my learners understand that what we do face-to-face and what we do online are similar, and yet they embrace the power of each of those environments. So that's what I really love about this first learning environment standard. Standard 2, learner engagement. Now, this is huge, and one of the biggest conversations I've had over the last 18 months with teachers as they're learning to do online, remote, blended, hybrid learning is my students aren't engaged. How can I make sure my students are engaged? And if you think about engagement, this is a big piece because that individualized instruction that technology allows us to have, where students can have more choice or freedom and flexibility in how they create content or receive content, watch a video, listen to a podcast, read an article, talk to the teacher. And then that meaningful learning experiences happen so that it's not just compliance-based engagement. I think we have transitioned more towards compliance-based engagement instead of cognitive engagement with this panic implementation of virtual and remote learning, because if the camera is on, I can see if your eyes are open, I can tell that you are sitting there and you've tuned into class, I call you engaged. That might just be compliance. That's just showing up. But are they really engaged in the content, that cognitive engagement? And so figuring out how to use technology to get better at assessing cognitive engagement is the overall encompassing goal of Standard 2. And that means that you're leveraging those online resources. You're allowing students to be creative in the ways that they are connecting. Sometimes with our older students, that could be asynchronously, that they can do things on their own time and then share with me that they have done that learning. And that gives them more flexibility and ownership. And so finding ways to build in engagement and agency. There's only 3 indicators for this second standard, but really it's about motivation. So we're allowing students to use technology as a learning tool, not just as a toy, which is something they need to learn. They don't inherently understand that. They know how to pick up a phone to play games, but do they know how to use that computing device in their pocket to really engage with the outside world, dig deep into the vast repository of knowledge that exists out there? And can they be independent learners without you in the room over their shoulder? Building independency and agency in students so that they can become self-motivated when they are in class or in virtual experiences is a huge piece of this standard. All right, Standard 3, instructional design. This one would be really into that organization space. So you've walked into a classroom before that's just like overwhelmingly busy, or there's so much stuff in there. The kids feel cluttered when they're in there. It's too intense. You might recommend to that teacher that we get rid of some of the visible clutter, that we clean up maybe some of the overwhelmingly busy spaces, and so the students can have a clean space to learn and feel comfortable in that physical space. Same thing goes with technology. Designing online spaces that feel organized and have clear goals for, I know where to go when I need to get my knowledge. I know how to deliver that knowledge to the teacher. I can communicate and collaborate with my classmates and my teacher cleanly and clearly through my online platform. That's what this one really talks about. One of the things that I work with a lot when I'm using Canvas as the learning management tool in some districts is organizing things into modules, because that's a way for the teacher to control the pace and exposure to the learning as they want to do it, versus a big long list of assignments and the teacher just puts more stuff up there and the kids don't know which one is due when. Really, it's clarity. Google Classroom has those topics that you can move around and put in order. Schoology, same thing. It's all about clarity of design. When you get into the indicators of this one, it's a little deeper. There are 5, 6 indicators. That's because they tried to break it down into those chunks that make sense. So designing and implementing structures for learning in the online and blended environment can feel overwhelming at first, but it's just like learning a new process for tying your shoes, right? Like it feels like you're going to have to be very thoughtful about the muscle movements the first few times, but then as it gets going, it gets easier because you can just repeat those same patterns. And that's what this one is really talking about, is finding a clarity of scope for what you're putting online and how you're doing it, potentially organizing that school district wide so that we're all organizing it in roughly the same way, but then allowing still for that teacher artistry. So the way that you develop your pages or assignments or discussions in our online learning management system might feel a little different for each class, but the student always knows they go to the same place to find them. And it just makes it easier. Now, assessment and measurement. I think other than engagement, this is the question that we get most often. How do I know that they're learning what I'm asking them to learn if I can't be there to watch them take that test, right? So if I'm going to monitor them taking that test in the classroom, I know they can't cheat because I'm standing right there, but I send them an assessment online and they're just going to Google it. And so that broad understanding of different ways to assess learning really comes into play here, because you're right. When you put someone out away from kind of the overseeing eye, they will have more flexibility and freedom to do things like look up the answers. And so we have to think about how students might engage with the content in a cognitively different way. When we're asking them to do thinking processes or to synthesize information, those things aren't as Googleable. And if it is a Googleable answer, have them Google it and then ask them, what keywords did you use to get there? How did you evaluate that source that you picked as the answer to make sure that it was authentic and relevant and timely? So allowing the fact that sometimes in our new version of learning, we will be able to Google things, but now we have to go a level deeper and say, why is that Googleable answer the one that I picked as the right answer? So there's just a little shift there. There's also so many great tools out there for fun and engaging ways to do review and checks for understanding. And you can use simple tools like our Google Forms and Forms in Microsoft to make those quick assessments or take surveys and pulses of the students so that they start to get a feel like you are still listening to me, you are still hearing where I am and giving me feedback, even if I'm online and we're just through a screen or we're asynchronous, not at the same time, not at the same place, but I still feel connected to you and the learning I'm supposed to achieve. The indicators for this one really get into the universal design for learning. So allowing that there are different times that we can track student learning, student pacing, and student self-reflection and self-understanding. That's where we dig in deeper here with this standard. Online assessments that really talk about validity, reliability is great for student learning, but also for student data. We wouldn't want to be using tools that are out there and free for teachers. If you just give us your student data, we would want to make sure that as a district level, building level, that we are giving our teachers enough tools that they don't feel like they have to go out and try to find their own version that might be free, but only free because they're collecting that student data or somehow getting that free lunch is not free. So that's a big piece in this standard. All right, standard 5, we're nearly done, over halfway there. Diverse and equitable instruction. This is one that we want to look at, especially when it comes to providing services to students who potentially don't have that privileged level of high-speed internet access, or they have an IEP or a 504, or they're coming from a lower income or potentially a different diverse background. So when we went into the classrooms, we could see all the students were here in the same space, and that allowed us for at least that first level of equitable. We're all here together. Then we can differentiate from there. We can provide supports. when students went home and we had to start teaching remotely, one of the biggest needs was for those students who received those types of supports in our building to still receive those types of supports out in their own homes. Now, this is still an evolving conversation, and we aren't going to get it right away because we are still learning to do this together. Nobody's ever tried to do this before. So what this standard is about is working towards that responsive understanding that student differences will be acknowledged and that we will be doing our best to try to promote that active learning for all our learners. One of the fast and easy things is to always have access to those closed captions. I know personally, I still listen to the TV, or I watch TV and I have the closed captions on, because it's easier for me. If I miss something in the audio, I can pick it up there. I also feel like I get more context and potentially new vocabulary if I'm watching a program that's from, say, England or in another language, I can pull that in. So just turning on closed captions can be an easy accommodation that allows all learners to learn, not just those who might have an auditory processing need or hard of hearing. I can still get benefits from that. The indicators in this standard really talk about like internet as a utility, just like turning on your lights or having heat in your house, having high-speed internet and access to a computing device that can do high-speed functions is almost a necessity in today's world. And so those digital equity issues should be addressed. And that's something with hardware and hotspots that we've been trying to do. But also that student diversity could look a lot of different categories. And so identifying student needs to promote learning and collaboration comes back to like knowing your students, making those connections, and being aware that technology in itself isn't going to fix a problem. You can't just tech it away, that you have to leverage it and you have to be creative with how you're using it. All right, standard 6, digital pedagogy. This is really thinking through that blended piece. So how are we using our technology to fold in rich and meaningful learning experiences? Now, blended is the key here because we will get back to a point where the majority of our learners will be in person with us. And yet we don't want to throw that proverbial baby out with the pandemic and not take the lessons we've learned about digital online learning. So using all those online resources, giving kids access to things they may have never had access to before, like field trips to the Gaza pyramids. Now we can do that virtually through Google Maps and potentially through Skype or using our video conferencing that we never would have had opportunities to before, or we thought that's too much work, that won't happen. Now we know it can, and it can happen really easily. So we have to make sure that we're still folding in quality pedagogy with the technology enhancing and lifting that learning. There's only 4 short indicators here, but really it comes back. Knowing your students and being responsive to their needs, taking current technologies and blending those together. So not trying to go back to the old overhead projector, but really embracing the power of our new individualized spaces that we can create through one-to-one programs and more connected classrooms. And then using those troubleshooting skills that we got really good at during the pandemic, where we now know how to do first round draft of what could I do if my screen goes black? What could I do if my mic's not working? Those are real learnings, and we need to embrace those and be proud of ourselves that we don't have to always ask someone else to fix it. We've got some first couple of ideas to try, and a lot of times that's going to fix it. Sometimes that's the 20% that gets you 80% of the way there, right? If you know 20% of some troubleshooting tricks, you're going to get 80% of the way there. And then you only have to reach out for a few of those bigger issues, like the blue screen of death. I've had that one before. Even I can't troubleshoot that one. So digital citizenship, man, this is one that just came along because we have to talk about being online requires some thoughtful ways to be a citizen, not just in person, but also when we are more anonymous and online. So do we do the right thing and treat people right, even when nobody's watching? digital citizenship has been in the news a lot because we've been talking about cyberbullying and the deep fakes and identity theft and phishing emails and ransomware to our schools now. So it's more than just, am I citing my sources if I get an online picture, or do I post only thoughtful comments on someone else's work? It's really about what is your role as a responsible person in this more connected environment as we're moving into workplace and college and career readiness skills, talking about, just because you can hack into that doesn't mean you should. And knowing the wrong and right online looks different than in person. And our moral compass is different when we're more anonymous online. So talking about that across content areas just as a blended part of our conversation, like we do with character traits. And so we talk about being thoughtful when it comes to how we treat people face to face. Now we also just throw in a few things every once in a while with how to treat people online, how to treat content, other people's belongings and property. And the indicators here really get into that, establishing the clear expectations for integrity. Can you copy and paste that because it was online? Probably not. What are you doing when we do have those moments where we need to grow? And so another recommendation is that you don't just punish by removing technology. So, you went out and you searched for inappropriate things. You were looking at inappropriate things on your school Chromebook. Therefore, we take the Chromebook away. Right now, that Chromebook is not a toy that you can just remove and give as a punishment. It's a tool that they misused. So we need to look at restorative practices when it comes to digital citizenship. Are we teaching them now how to be thoughtful about technology, how to think about how those images that were inappropriate or exploitive, and how we need to be better about that, when not to do things? And they should have some type of reteaching about digital citizenship skills, and yet they need to maintain access to that tool because it is a class tool. We wouldn't take their pens and paper away and say you're never allowed to write for 2 weeks because we know they need to write in their classes. So we can't take away their digital access to that tool because that will decrease their ability to engage in those learning opportunities. So thinking about restorative practices when it comes to digital citizenship is huge. And that's going to be a shift that we would look at over the next few years as we come out of the panic implementation again and into what we feel like will be the new blended and digitally enhanced learning and teaching environments. All right, last one, professional responsibilities. So as instructors and leaders of instructors, we really need to model what we're talking about. This is the practice what you preach standard. So if we are telling students they should collaborate with each other, we as instructional leaders and instructional facilitators in the classroom, we should be collaborating with each other. If we're talking about digital citizenship, we better be modeling digital citizenship. We shouldn't be copying and pasting images from wherever we find them on the internet. We should be making sure that we cite our sources. We should be limiting our screen time. We should do all those things. Following legal and ethical guidelines. We wouldn't want our students' data out there or putting it out where anybody could access it. We shouldn't be putting our data out there unless we've thoroughly looked through those privacy policies and thought about what's going to happen with it. And then we want our kids to be curious and always learning. So we need to model that too. We have to have continuous professional growth and finding new ways to champion our own learning and saying, gosh, I didn't know I was going to have to learn how to troubleshoot all my own mic connections for video conferencing over the last 18 months, but man, I learned it and I want to celebrate that. So making sure that we model that those unexpected learnings are valid. And that's a big piece too, as we come out of, we hopefully come out of the pandemic implementation and we're looking at how we're going forward. The indicators in Standard 8 really talk about modeling and doing what you need to do as the lead learner, the instructor, the facilitator, to bring the students into a space that feels like it's not just true for you, it's true for us all. Now, how can you use these? This is the heart of the matter. Now that you really have a feel for what the Indiana Department of Education was gearing up to present out as these standards for educators, I would suggest that you might do something similar to this example from Mount Vernon Schools. Misty Hall shared this with me and said I can share it with you. So let's take a look at what this is. She has created these essential learnings where they took a look at the key standards and pulled out those priority standards that based upon the frameworks that they use in their school district. And you'll notice here on the prioritized standard, like she's looking at relationships and foundations being essential learning. That's across the content areas, across in-person and virtual. They focus on relationships and foundations with the students. And so she looked at those standards and said that those fit in with standards 1, the learning environments, and pulled out some key vocabulary that really indicate a level that she would want her teachers to have kind of that working language, and then develop some I can statements. And this is what they do for their own standards in the classroom. So she was working with them to do this for themselves as professional learners. Now, the step you might take over something like this after those I can statements is to find your look fors. So working with your teachers and your understanding, what does it look like in the classroom if you saw norms for student interactions with the teacher? Would they be posted on the wall in the physical classroom? Would they also be addressed in the virtual classroom? And is that something that you could indicate as you were doing not just a walkthrough, but really a feedback loop with your teachers as they are continuing to grow in virtual learning? When you click on this link in the PowerPoint, you will be able to access this essential learnings document and make your own copy. You'll go to File, make a copy. She has graciously said that you can take this, adapt it, use it for your own, maybe use it as an exemplar, but this is going to be a document that you could use just to see what one school district is doing with these educator standards for blended and online teaching to create a space where they have conversations that can happen. This probably is not evaluative, right? So you wouldn't want to talk about how this would evaluate on their RISE rubric at this point. This might just be for you to use to have a conversation, maybe with you, an instructional coach, about places that we could go further as we grow together. So thank you so much for spending some time with me to learn about the educator standards for blended and online teaching and thinking about ways that you might look for cross connections to see how to use them with your own frameworks and priorities in your school or district, and really looking at how we can change the landscape through a collaborative shared effort moving forward. I'm Lena Darnay from Keep Indiana Learning, a part of CIESC. Please reach out to me if you have any questions, and thank you for joining me today.